Hello, my dear students. Welcome to the next class of Structuralism. Today, we will be completing a discussion on Structuralism and Structuralist Narratology. We are continuing the discussion of Gerard Genette, and we are going to see his different types of narration, that is extra-diegetic, intra-diegetic, and different narrators, that is homo-diegetic and heterodiegetic. And also, we will be talking about Todorov, the Bulgarian French critic. Let's get into the slides. So we are dealing with Gerard Genette and his ideas, and we discussed about narrative voice. In that we saw narrative instance, narrative time, and narrative levels. Then we moved into the narrative levels, and we have seen order, analepsis, prolepsis, metalepsis. Then in duration we saw the rhythm at which events take place, and we saw frequency, mood, and we saw paralepsis, and now we are moving into perspective. Perspective is based on the role of the narrator. We have several perspectives in a narrative: first person, second person, third person, and perspective is based on the role of the narrator and the location of the narrator in relation to the story being told. There can be the instances where we can locate the narrator. The narrator has 5 main functions. One is narrative, one is directing, one is testimonial, communicative, and ideological. And what is the first function of narrator? That is narrative. That is to tell the story. That is the main function of narrator, to tell the story. Story എന്താണെന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ അത് പറയുക. Second function is of directing. That is narrator in the story while the story is progressing. It tells, he or she, the narrator tells or describes the process of narration or her or his sources of the narrative and the organization of the story, where the narrator interrupts the story. If you have read Wuthering Heights, you can easily identify it with Lockwood. The third function is about testimonial. That is, the narrator affirms the truth of the story. He repeats that in the story. The testimonial involves description of narrator's intellectual response to the events. He make comments about certain events, maybe in an intellectual way, or it in an emotional way, or the narrator would describe about his response in a political way to the events that he was narrating. Another function of the narrator is communicative. In that, you can see the reader is directly addressed by the narrator as "Dear Reader." This you can easily identify with Jane Eyre, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, where you can see Jane Eyre is speaking to readers or addressing readers like this: "Dear reader, I married him." This is an instance of communicative function. The fifth one is ideological, where the narrator uses the story and he or she generalize about certain universal matters and make certain comments. For example, if it's a story related to the plight of a woman, a single woman, then the narrator would make a comment like, "This is the fate of all women." And we can analyze that it is an ideological function which was done by narrator. He used the story and he generalized certain things. It would be an ideological comment that steps out of the text to describe a general condition. Every narrative for Janet has certain elements. Every narrative would have the story, every narrative would have narrative discourse, and every narrative would have narration. And the story is the actual order of events in the text. In the text, there would be some order of events, that birth, the growth, the mature period, the death. An example, okay. There would be the actual order of events. That is the story. And there would be narrative discourse. That the statements in the story that constitute narrative discourse. The statements, the words, the statements, that is the narrative discourse. And the third one is narration. That is the act of making the statements, the process, the telling of the story. That is the narration. So narrative discourse is embedded in the narration of the story. Okay, so make sure you remember three elements: story, narrative discourse, and the narration. Focalization. Now we are moving into focalization. It's a term coined by Gerard Genette. Focalization refers to the perspective. In what perspective through which the narrative is presented before the readers. There can be internal focalization or external focalization or zero focalization. What do you mean by internal focalization? It means that the narrative focuses on thoughts and emotions of the character by the narrator. The narrator would be focusing on the thoughts and emotions of the character when the narrator is narrating the story. Next is external focalization. That is, the character's actions or behaviors would be more prominent in the external focalization. The narrator would be narrating the character's actions and behaviors more. Next is zero focalization. That is, the narrator would be like an omniscient narrator, and the narrator would be dealing with internal focalization and external focalization. Narrator would be focusing on the thoughts and emotions of the character, and also the narrator would be focusing on the actions and behaviors on the character. And zero focalization, it is that the narrator's role would be omniscient. Then Genette focuses on heterodiegetic and homodiegetic narrators. Homodiegetic narrators means that narrator would be inside the story. Narrator would be inside the story. For example, Nellie in Wuthering Heights. Nellie's narration is homodiegetic narration, and she is a homodiegetic narrator, and she is a character in the story, and she participates in the action of the story she narrates. Nellie in Wuthering Heights, it's a homodiegetic narrator. Please read on Nellie more and more about in the Wuthering Heights. Please read about her more. She is one of the narrators along with Lockwood. Her narration is homodiegetic because she participates in the action of the story. And the other one is heterodiegetic narrator. That is, the character or the narrator would not be the part of the story, but the narrator describes experiences of the characters that appear in the story, but he is not the part of the story. Now we are moving into extradiegetic narration and intradiegetic narration. Extradiegetic narration is the first level of narrative or the main text of the novel. For example, if you have read the novel Frankenstein, the novel is the extradiegetic level. And we got extradiegetic narrator also. extradiegetic narrator stands outside the text. Extradiegetic narrator will not be involved with the events, and it stands beyond the story, or you can say it stands outside the story, and we can commonly call it as omniscient or the third person narrator in the extradiegetic narration. The second narration is intradiegetic narration. It is the second level embedded as a narrative itself within the first level. For example, വാൾട്ടൻ്റെ സ്റ്റോറി ഫ്രാങ്കൻസ്റ്റീൻ എന്ന നോവലിൽ വാൾട്ടൻ്റെ സ്റ്റോറി വിക്ടർ ഫ്രാങ്കൻസ്റ്റീനെ മീറ്റ് ചെയ്യുന്ന സ്റ്റോറി, ഇത് ഫസ്റ്റ് ലെവലിൻ്റെ ഉള്ളിൽ നിൽക്കുന്നതാണ്. ആൻഡ് വി ക്യാൻ കോൾ ദിസ് സ്റ്റോറി ഓഫ് വാൾട്ടൺ meeting Victor is the second level of the narration, and it is the intradiegetic narration. It contains the events of the text or the story of the text. When a character of extradiegetic narration, when a character of the first level of narration tells another character a story, main ടെക്സ്റ്റിലെ ഒരു ക്യാരക്ടർ വേറൊരു ക്യാരക്ടറിനോട് ഒരു സ്റ്റോറി പറയുമ്പോൾ സ്റ്റോറി പറയുന്ന ആൾ ഇൻട്രാഡൈജറ്റിക് നെറേറ്റർ ആവുന്നു. ഇൻട്രാഡൈജറ്റിക് നെറേറ്റർ സ്റ്റാൻഡ്സ് ഇൻസൈഡ് ദ ടെക്സ്റ്റ്, ഇൻസൈഡ് ദി ഹോൾ ടെക്സ്റ്റ്. Extradiegetic narrator stands outside the whole text. So in the work Frankenstein, the main text is extradiegetic. Then Walton's story about Victor Frankenstein in the letters to his sister, Walton is the narrator. It is intradiegetic narration because it is in the second level, and Walton acts like a heterodiegetic narrator because Walton stands outside the story of Victor Frankenstein that he is narrating. When Victor Frankenstein tells his story about his own life, narrator is Victor Frankenstein, and later we can see it shifts to the monster also. The type of narration is intradiegetic because it is in the second level embedded in the first level. And the type of narrator is homodiegetic because Victor Frankenstein itself the character in the story which he is narrating. So we can call it as Victor Frankenstein. The narration is intradiegetic, homodiegetic. He is intradiegetic, homodiegetic narrator, and he narrates those aspects of the story with which he is familiar. So it is a bit complicated. Reread it, reread different references, then you will be able to understand it more clearly. So that's it all about extradiegetic narration and intradiegetic narration. Extradiegetic, it is very easy that it stands outside the text, the whole text. Narrator stands outside the text, and the level of narration is extradiegetic when we speak about the whole text. Intradiegetic, it is a second level. That second level is embedded in the first level of narration. And heterodiegetic narrator, who is not a character in the story, the narrator who is not a character in the story, and homodiegetic narrator, that the narrator who is telling the story is itself a character in the story he tells. And when we move into autodiegetic narrator, that is when a character narrates her or her own tale, they may be described as autodiegetic narrator. For example, in autobiographies, the story of my experiments with the truth, that is autodiegetic narration, that is speaking about her own tale, then we can say definitely it has homodiegetic also, because the character would be inside, the narrator would be inside the story he or she is telling. And now we are moving into transtextuality. We know intertextuality, that is the relationship between, or the connection between the two texts. In one particular text you may have the references of another text. You can call it as intertextual connection or intertextuality. But Janet proposed the term transtextuality as a more inclusive term than intertextuality. He defined transtextuality as the textual transcendence of the text, beyond the text. There are certain elements that stands beyond the text. Textual things that lies beyond the text. And according to Gerard Janet, transtextuality is all that sets the text in relationship. The relationship would be explicit or concealed one with other text, and it covers all aspects of a particular text. Janet provides 5 subtypes of transtextuality. He speaks about paratext, intertextuality, architecturality, metatextuality, and hypertextuality. In the work Paratext, which was published in 1997, he analyzes certain old narratives and narrative devices. He spoke about intertextuality and he proposed the more wider term transtextuality. We have seen it. And 5 main types of intertextuality or transtextuality. And first one is paratext. Paratext is that it contains epigraphs, preface, forewords, epilogues, addressed to the reader, acknowledgements, footnotes, drafts, illustrations that are connected to the main narrative. ഇപ്പോൾ നമുക്കൊരു നോവൽ നമ്മുടെ കയ്യിലുണ്ടെന്ന് വെച്ച് കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ ആ മെയിൻ നെറേറ്റീവിനോട് ചേർന്നിട്ട് ചിലപ്പോൾ ഒരുപാട് മെറ്റീരിയൽസ് വേറെ ഉണ്ടാവാം. മേ ബി ഗിവൻ ബൈ ദി ഓഥർ, given by the editor, given by the printer, given by the publishers. These are all called paratext. These are also the elements that got added to the main text. For example, epigraph. What is epigraph? That is the short quotation at the beginning of a book. Maybe it would be giving the theme of the work, or epilogue towards the end of the work, which would give us a conclusion about the work. These are all called as paratext. Next one is intertextuality. Intertextuality refers to the allusions or references to other works, which would also contain quotations, citations. See, T.S. Eliot in the Wasteland, we have references of other works. For example, Women Beware Women, our work in the reference under. Then French Lieutenant's Women, John Fowler's work, ഒരുപാട് works in the intertextual reference വരുന്നുണ്ട്. He actually gives us several quotations from other poets and writers. So intertextuality refers to the allusions or references to other works, or echoes or quotes or citations. Architecturality, next type of intertextuality, it is architecturality. It is the relationship of a text to other text in the same genre. ഒരേ ജാനറിലുള്ള 2 ടെക്സ്റ്റ് തമ്മിലുള്ള റിലേഷൻഷിപ്പാണ് ആർക്കിടെക്ച്വാലിറ്റി എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്. മെറ്റാടെക്ച്വാലിറ്റി എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് എന്താണ്? ഇറ്റ് ഈസ് ദ റിലേഷൻഷിപ്പ് ബിറ്റ്വീൻ എ ടെക്സ്റ്റ് ആൻഡ് ദ ക്രിട്ടിക്കൽ കമൻട്രി. ഇപ്പോൾ ഒരു മെയിൻ ടെക്സ്റ്റ്, അതിനെ അനുബന്ധിച്ചുള്ള ക്രിട്ടിക്കൽ കമൻട്രീസ് ഉള്ള വേറെ ടെക്സ്റ്റ് ഉണ്ടാവാം. That relationship is called metatextuality. Relationship between a text and the biographical commentaries, adum undavam, and the relationship between a text and the other references on the main text, adum undavam. These are all metatextuality. Example of metatextuality. ഒരുപാട് പണ്ടത്തെ ഓഥേഴ്സിനെ സംബന്ധിച്ച് അവരുടെ വർക്കും അതിനോട് ക്രിട്ടിക്കലായിട്ടുള്ള ഒരുപാട് എസ്സേസ് പബ്ലിഷ് ചെയ്തിട്ടുണ്ട്. ഇപ്പോൾ ഷെല്ലീൻ്റെ വർക്കിന് ഓട്ട് വാസ് സ്കൈലാർക്ക് വി ഹാവ് ഹാർമോണിയസ് മാഡ്നസ് ഒരു ഫ്രേസ് ഉണ്ട്. ഹാർമോണിയസ് മാഡ്നസ് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ് തന്നെ ഒരു എസ്സേയും പബ്ലിഷ് ചെയ്തിട്ടുണ്ട്. ദീസ് ആർ ഓൾ ഇൻ മെറ്റാടെക്ച്വാലിറ്റി എന്ന് നമുക്ക് പറയാൻ പറ്റും. നെക്സ്റ്റ് ഇസ് ഹൈപ്പർടെക്ച്വാലിറ്റി. ഇറ്റ് റിസംബിൾസ് മെറ്റാടെക്ച്വാലിറ്റി ഇൻ എ വേ, ബട്ട് it refers to the text that come later or after the main or original text. Original text എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് ഹൈപ്പോ ടെക്സ്റ്റും പിന്നെ അത് കഴിഞ്ഞ് വരുന്ന ടെക്സ്റ്റിനെ ഹൈപ്പർ ടെക്സ്റ്റ് എന്നും പറയാൻ പറ്റും. നമ്മൾക്ക് ഷേക്സ്പിയറിൻ്റെ കിങ് ലിയർ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുള്ള വർക്ക് ഉണ്ട് അല്ലേ, ഡ്രാമയുണ്ട് കിങ് ലിയർ. എഡ്വേർഡ് ബോണ്ട് ലിയർ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞിട്ട് അതിൻ്റെ ഒരു അഡാപ്റ്റേഷനും ഉണ്ട്. വി ക്യാൻ സേ ഇറ്റ് ഈസ് ദി hypertextuality. Another example is that we got the hypertext, that main text as Frankenstein, and the hypertext, a spoof, which was published as Frankenstein according to Spike Milligan. It is an hypertext. So in structural narratology, we have Roland Barthes, and we have already seen his analysis, structural analysis of a narrative, how he broke up the narrative into its constituent elements and how he combined all these elements together, and he developed 5 different codes: Pavaratty code, hermeneutic code, cultural code, semicode, symbolic code. These are all these terms or these things also comes under structural narratology. And now we are moving on to Zahedinov. He is a Bulgarian French structuralist, narrative critic, philosopher, and he builds on the notion that there is a definite grammar or rule to all text. He discovered that narratives moved forward in a chronological order, that is one action following after another action. The narratives have a clear beginning, middle and end. And also he spoke about 3 components of text: semantic component, syntactic component and verbal component. Semantic would be the form of the text. Syntactic would be the arrangement of structural units. കറക്റ്റായിട്ട് ഉള്ള അറേഞ്ച്മെൻറ്റ്. ഒരു സിൻടാക്സ് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് എന്താണ്? സെൻറ്റൻസ് ഓർഡർ ഉണ്ടാവും. ഓരോ വേർഡ്സും എങ്ങനെയാണ് അറേഞ്ച് ചെയ്യേണ്ടത് എന്നുള്ള ഓർഡർ ഉണ്ടാവും. സെയിം വേ ഒരു ടെക്സ്റ്റിലും അതിൻ്റെ ഓർഡർ ഉണ്ടാവും, എങ്ങനെയാണ് അറേഞ്ച് ചെയ്യേണ്ടതെന്നുള്ളത്. And also he identified another component as verbal, that is the words and phrases through which the story is told. നമ്മൾ സ്ട്രക്ചറലിസം ആണ് പഠിക്കുന്നത്, അതുകൊണ്ടാണ് ഇത്രയും ഡീറ്റെയിൽഡ് ആയിട്ട് ഓരോരോ എലമെൻറ്റിനെ കുറിച്ച് നോക്കുന്നത്. വേർഡ്സ് ആൻഡ് ഫ്രേസസിൽ കൂടെ തന്നെയാണ് സ്റ്റോറി ഫോം ചെയ്തിരിക്കുന്നത്. ആ വേർഡ്സ് ആൻഡ് ഫ്രേസസ് വരുന്നത് വെർബൽ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ കോമ്പണൻറ്റിൻ്റെ കീഴിലാണ്. ഓക്കെ, സെമാൻറ്റിക് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് ഫോം ആയിരിക്കാം, ആ ടെക്സ്റ്റിൻ്റെ ഫോം ആയിരിക്കാം. ഇപ്പോൾ പല പല ഫോംസ് ഉണ്ടാവാം ഒരു ടെക്സ്റ്റിന്, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ പോയറ്റിക് ഫോം ഉണ്ടാവാം, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഡ്രമാറ്റിക് ഫോംസ് ഉണ്ടാവാം, പല പല ഫോം ഉണ്ടാവാം. ഏത് ഫോമിലാണ് അത് അറേഞ്ച് ചെയ്തിരിക്കുന്നത്, ദാറ്റ് ഇസ് സെമാൻറ്റിക്. സിൻടാക്റ്റിക് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് ഏത് രീതിയിലാണ് അറേഞ്ച്മെൻറ്റ് എന്നുള്ളതാണ്. ഓരോ സ്ട്രക്ചറൽ യൂണിറ്റിനും ഓരോ അറേഞ്ച്മെൻറ്റ് ഉണ്ടാവാം. നമ്മൾ ഇംഗ്ലീഷിൽ ഫോളോ ചെയ്യുന്ന സിൻടാക്റ്റിക് സ്ട്രക്ചർ എന്താണ്? SVO ആണ് അല്ലേ? അങ്ങനെയാണെങ്കിൽ മാത്രമേ നമുക്ക് മീനിങ്സ് ഡിറൈവ് ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റുള്ളൂ. ആൻഡ് തോദറോവ് focuses mainly on the syntax, the rules of combination, and he was looking into the narrative to understand several rules of combination. He distinguished between prepositions and sequences, and he showed that every preposition there is a limited number of things that can happen. ഇപ്പോൾ preposition എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോൾ ഒരു നറേറ്റീവിൽ ഏതെങ്കിലും ഒരു ആക്ഷൻ ആയിരിക്കാം preposition എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്. And he distinguished between propositions and sequences. പല പല ആക്ഷൻസ് ഉണ്ടാവും, ഒരു നെറേറ്റീവിൽ ഒരുപാട് ആക്ഷൻസ് ഉണ്ടാവാം. And proposition is that an action performed by the character or by an agent. And these propositions, these actions are the basic building blocks of all narrative. And propositions have to be arranged in a sequence or in an order to generate a story. Actions have to be arranged in an order. These propositions can be arranged in any of the three sequences: temporal, logical, or spatial. Temporal sequence is that where there is a sequence of time. This happened and then this happened. Time അനുസരിച്ചിട്ട് ആദ്യം ഇത് സംഭവിച്ചു, പിന്നെ ഇത് സംഭവിച്ചു, അങ്ങനെ there is a sequence in time, and the propositions are arranged like that on temporal sequence. And when propositions are arranged in logical sequence, that is cause effect, based on the cause and effect sequence, it is called as logical sequence. And the spatial sequence is that where the plot has many subdivisions. This happened, meanwhile this other thing also happened, based on the subdivisions. So propositions or the basic actions have to be arranged in a sequence to generate the story or to generate the actual meaning of the story. There can be many sequences in a text, and propositions can be arranged in any of the three sequences. See, for example, R.K. Narayan, the famous novelist, and in his work The Guide, I can tell you about several different propositions in the work. The Guide. First one is Raju, the main character, meets Rosie, another character. The second basic action or the main action, you can say it as Rosie and Raju fall in love. The third one is that Raju encourages her art. Raju encourages her to dance well. And the fourth one is that she becomes popular. Fifth one is that he betrays her trust. And the sixth one is that Raju goes away from Rosie. Seventh one is about he got transformed into a saint by certain events. And the eighth one is that he accepts that sainthood. These are the basic actions in a narrative. In this narrative, The Guide. And these actions can be arranged in any of the three sequences, in a temporal way, logical way, or spatial way. Temporal way is that where there is a sequence in time. Actions are arranged in a sequence in time. This happened and then this happened, like that. The logical way or the logical sequence in a propositions can be arranged where there is a cause effect sequence. This happened and therefore this happened. And the third sequence is that of spatial. Propositions can be arranged in spatial sequence. That is where the main plot has many subdivisions. One thing happens at the same time, other event or other thing also happens. Other thing also happens. That is the spatial sequence. In a plot, different things, different narrative or different events are arranged together. One plot which would have many subdivisions. This one event happens, meanwhile the other thing also happens, and the narrator arranges those events together to generate the story. And narrative structure theory by Todorov is about how the narration in a story is created. And he mentions 5 stages that a character go through. His theory basically states that the story's plot lines follow the same pattern or path. Every story you can find the story moves in a same pattern. 5 steps are there in a pattern, are there in this pattern. One is equilibrium, second one is disruption, third is realization, fourth is restored order, and fifth is equilibrium again. First one is that, first part of the story is that will display a happy start. All the characters are remaining in a happy mood. There is no problem there is no problem in the first part. Everything is moving in a happy and content way. Second one is that disruption. This happiness will be disrupted by a problem or by another event or something. Third one is about realization. This part of the plot is when everyone realizes the problem and the chaos created by the problem. That's the realization. Restored order is that the characters attempts to repair the damage, and they try to solve the problem. The actions taken by the characters to solve the problem, and finally somehow the problem is getting solved in this step. And the last one is equilibrium again. This is the final part of the plot where the problem is resolved and the normality resumes again. Everyone is free. ഏതൊരു മൂവി എടുത്താലും നമുക്ക് ഈ ഒരു രീതിയിലാണ് വർക്ക് പോകുന്നതായിട്ട് കാണാൻ പറ്റുന്നത്. സാധാരണ ഒരു നറേഷൻ, ഒരു സ്റ്റോറി എടുത്തു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ ആദ്യമേ ക്യാരക്ടേഴ്സ് എല്ലാം പ്രശ്നങ്ങളൊന്നുമില്ല, ഹാപ്പി ആയിട്ടായിരിക്കും അവരുടെ സിറ്റുവേഷൻസ് നമുക്ക് കാണാൻ പറ്റുന്നത്. പിന്നെ അവരുടെ ഇടയിലോട്ടൊരു പ്രോബ്ലം വരുന്നു, അതാണ് രണ്ടാമത്തെ പാർട്ട്, ദാറ്റ് ഇസ് ഡിസ്ട്രപ്ഷൻ. പിന്നെ മൂന്നാമത്തേതെന്ന് പറയുമ്പോൾ ക്യാരക്ടേഴ്സ് എല്ലാം ആ ഒരു പ്രോബ്ലം റിയലൈസ് ചെയ്യുന്നതും അതിൻ്റെ പ്രശ്നങ്ങളും ഖയോസൊക്കെ ആയിട്ടാണ് മൂന്നാമത്തത്, ദാറ്റ് ഇസ് റിയലൈസേഷൻ. ഫോർത്ത് വൺ ഇസ് ദാറ്റ് അതിൻ്റെ ആ ഒരു പ്രശ്നങ്ങളെല്ലാം സോൾവ് ചെയ്യാൻ വേണ്ടിയിട്ടുള്ള അറ്റംപ്റ്റ്സ് ആയിരിക്കും. പിന്നെ ദെൻ ദേ ആർ ട്രൈങ് ടു സോൾവ് ദ പ്രോബ്ലംസ് ഔട്ട്. Fifth one എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോൾ എല്ലാ പ്രോബ്ലംസും സോൾവ്ഡ് ആയി, the characters are free again. These are the narrative different steps spoke by Todorov. And in his work, The Fantastic, A Structural Approach to a Literary Genre, it is a major work of Todorov. It is still used as a standard point of reference in genre studies. I just mentioned this work to make you understand or to make you familiarize with this work. The Fantastic, A Structural Approach to a Literary Genre. So from this we are concluding our discussion on structuralism. Read from different sources, get more knowledge, and we will meet up with post-structuralism deconstruction in our next class. Happy learning.